Okay, and welcome back. I hope everyone is ready to crack on. Our next presenter is Niranjani Manoharan. She will talk about from getting from rags to riches and how to turn your mobile test automation into a Cinderella story. So that will be a fairy tale. Uh, Niranjani works at Lyft. She's an enthusiastic engineer who is passionate about writing code to break applications. So, software, be aware and scared. In this talk, she will share her experience driving test automation from rags to riches at companies such as Lyft and Pinterest. She will discuss the practices of building a team and culture to support test automation, as well as failures and mishaps that they endured. So, Niranjani, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Hey there, as we're all stuck at home due to this pandemic, would it help if I transport you all to a fairy tale for the next 30 minutes? So, without further ado, let's get started. Um, so, I currently lead test automation efforts at Lyft in California, and I personally like to learn something new from any talk, and I find it easier to understand if there are GitHub examples which I can check out after the talk. So I've narrowed down the scope of this talk to testing Android apps, and I'll be using a sandbox application throughout the talk, for which I will be sharing the GitHub link at the end of the presentation. So let's get started. I have a goal to get us geared up for this talk. So if you all could respond to each of these questions by inputting one, two, three, or four in the chat box corresponding to each of the questions, it would be great. This would just help me understand the diversity of the crowd present. Uh, So, how many of you work at startups? Do you have weekly releases? Anyone having daily releases? And last one, how many folks with mobile testing background? I'm just going to give another 10 seconds for people to input. Thank you for your input. I'm moving on. So, we've all heard of Cinderella's story as kids, but has any one of you thought about a scenario where Cinderella time travels into the current world and ends up being a quality engineer, say in the Silicon Valley of the United States? Well, I'm being a bit biased here as I come from the Golden State myself. So, let me introduce you to our modern day Cinderella. She's the first quality engineer at a startup and is baffled as to what is expected of her, especially in terms of test automation. Now, in the course of this talk, we're going to give her tips and tricks that she can apply in her day job, basically recreating the fairy tale that she's popular for, but in the alter universe, which is a tech world. So let's begin with helping our modern day Cinderella define her automation strategy. Our modern day Cinderella needs to understand her product first. What are the limitations she's working with, and what are the different realms she can delve into, which would add value to the company? What problem are they trying to solve? Since she is the first quality engineer in her company, we want her to define the scope of her role. She also needs to find out how and when she can introduce automation into the process. Basically, draft a test plan, define stakeholders, and strategize how it will all play out. The next thing would be, what are her business needs? How many of you feel, as a quality engineer, you don't need to understand how the business operates and you just want to do your job? Let me give you an example. Back at Pinterest, any idea how the revenue was generated? It was completely through ads. All those promoted pins you see, those are the ones, when clicked, creates revenue for Pinterest. So we focused our efforts on testing promoted pins than regular pins, as that was the business need. Next up is testing culture. Now, this is huge and it'll take time, irrespective of what type of company we work for. Instilling testing culture varies in terms of different degrees based on which stage the company is currently performing at. Our fairy tale Cinderella had three challenges in the form of her stepmother and her stepsisters. But our modern day Cinderella has a different set of challenges. Let's see what they are. The first one being locator controversy. Given all of us at some point in our careers have used Selenium to do web automation, I'm sure the following types of locators are familiar. Now, these are common for mobile as well. Given our modern day Cinderella is testing mobile apps, let's try to help solve her locator controversy. Based on her theoretical knowledge, she knows that IDs are the best locators. But then some of the elements on the application don't have IDs, they only have text. So, what can she do? Well, for starters, uh, she can explain to her developers about the importance of using identifiers over text in automation, which will make her tests more stable. But 60% of the time, especially if you're the first quality engineer on your team, we can imagine how that conversation will go. So let's try to do it ourselves. So Android Studio and IntelliJ are different IDEs that are used for Android development, which has a tool called Layout Inspector that allows you to inspect each element. Now, this screenshot is a quick glimpse of the sandbox application that I'll be using throughout the talk for coding purposes. Now that we know this is the element that doesn't have an identifier, all we need to do is find the corresponding layout. And once you figure that out from the layout.xml, you can just go ahead and add the locator ID. Now let's move on to Cinderella's second challenge, the custom matcher rivalry. So hamcrest is a framework for software tests. Hamcrest allows checking for conditions in your code via existing matcher classes. To use hamcrest matchers in JUnit, you use the assert that statement followed by one or more matchers. There are scenarios for which we don't have a matcher defined yet. Then what do? It also allows you to define your custom matcher implementations. Here are some reasons why they can be useful. So, using assert equals to validate your results in a scenario where you don't have a matcher is a simple way but too painful. When you do have a custom matcher, it gives your asserts more meaning. Finally, all applications these days adhere to accessibility norms. Having custom matchers can be super useful to ease your accessibility testing. Now, let's look at an example for testing accessibility on Android applications. A use case where you need to validate the font size. Now, there's no hamcrest matcher in Espresso. That's the framework we're using here for Android application testing. That will allow you to do that. So, in this example, I'm going to show you how to add one. So, type-safe matcher is a base class for matchers. In order to create a custom matcher, we need to extend it. So, font size matcher is a new class that we're creating, which extends type-safe matcher. Uh, One second. My clicker doesn't seem to be working. Oh, no, I got it. Yeah. So next we need to override the parent class's methods. namely matches safely and describe to methods. Now, the matches safely will add an if condition to verify that the view we are testing is indeed a text view and then grabs the font size. In the describe to method, we validate that the font size is indeed the expected value. Finally, in your test, my clicker again is not working. Got it. Okay. So finally, in your test, you just need to add this matcher to validate the font size, and that's it. You just create your own hamcrest matcher. Now, this will come in handy while our modern day Cinderella tries to automate her scenarios. You'll find all of these examples in the GitHub link, which is available in the reference section. So, moving on. So, now let's give her, our modern day Cinderella, a quick glimpse of some of the challenges I faced at Pinterest and lived through our case study section. So at Pinterest, as you can see, there are five different types of pins. Normal pins, which are images, recipe pins or home decor pins. And when you click through, it takes you to a blog or website. And there are ads, which are basically promoted pins, and they are in the form of GIFs and video pins. Now, promoted pins, along with video pins, are the most valuable, mainly because they generate revenue for Pinterest. Every single click is X cents for the company. We track analytics within our automated tests, which test the complete end to end for each use case and thus adds value. So, one of our major goals at Pinterest was to reduce time spent during regression testing. As mentioned earlier, we had an offshore team which took a week to complete regression, and we spent around $300,000 a year for doing regression testing. And we had a monthly release cycle, out of which, 2 weeks was for development and 1 week was for testing. And the last week was for validating bug fixes. So to begin, we decided to automate the P0 and P1 test cases in house in order to reduce cost spent on offshore testing, which would also help us move faster in our release cycle. So the acceptance criteria in this case, let me explain. When I joined Pinterest, out of our team of four, the two manual quality engineers were responsible for defining our test cases. And I was responsible for automation on the Android platform, and we had another engineer working on the iOS platform. So once I completed automating that use case, uh, they would check out the code on their laptop and run five tests. Run the test five times to make sure that the test case they were validating all the values they needed to, and it was not flaky, and also verify that analytics results were also reliable. By the way, we defined this acceptance criteria since for a company like Pinterest, validating analytics through our automated tests would translate to all of our analytic events being fired correctly, which in turn means we hit our revenue targets for the quarter. So, as mentioned previously, it translates to quality engineers having to go through each test case and also verify analytics that was being generated correctly. So, this is a predictable workflow and redundant. Hence, it was a good candidate for automation. So, the acceptance criteria for a test case was to validate the UI screens and ensure analytics returned expected response. Now, the project of automating regression test cases plus validating analytics was helpful in the sense that it helped reduce the cost spent on offshore testing, around $300,000, which is a huge value add, and it helped find bugs within our analytics service as well. So it also helped us move from a monthly release cycle to a weekly one. So this could differ based on the company and product you're working on. So my with regard to scalability, my selling point was that I was going to use a test runner to parallelize the test runs. Apart from that, I also work with a build team to use Buck builds, which are faster than Gradle builds. Main difference being Buck caches all the dependencies. And as a company, we also made the move to Kubernetes clusters. So these changes translated to me updating my CI script to have a Kubernetes dependency added on top of my existing flag.yaml file, which was responsible for parallelization. Now let's take a step back and take a peek into how we went about developing a robust and extensible test framework. Since the majority of Pinterest's daily active users are on mobile, they are a mobile first company, and I was focused on developing a test framework on the Android platform. I used a framework called Espresso. I'm sure many of you have heard of it. Since Espresso is an instrumentation based framework, it'll install the test APK onto the device and then kick off the test. The test APK interacts with a backend server and with the authentication server while handling the request responses from within the test. As mentioned earlier, remember our focus was on promoted pins and videos, which typically means we need to have those pins on our home feed to be able to click through and track analytics. When we first developed our tests, we would just scroll through our feed until we found a promoted pin, but that wasn't scaling well. There were tests that kept scrolling through the feed searching for promoted pins, which meant the test execution time had significantly increased. If I remember correctly, around 100 tests were taking close to 90 minutes to run, which wasn't ideal. So, how could we have structured our framework better? We wrote a script that would call APIs to add certain types of pins to specific test accounts as part of a setup script that would run every morning before the test kicked off. We came up with the concept of test account pool, which contains test accounts categorized into different pools based on the type of pins they held. From within my test, all I have to do is choose which enum type, that is the type of user for my test. And this practice is called clean dependency separation. Let's look at our challenge, the next challenge, which is the rule chain conundrum. To explain this, let's take a peek at a case study from Lyft. This is a classic workflow of how a passenger requests a ride and cancels it later. I'm sure you're noticing the language here. It's definitely not English. So each and every test has to go through the login flow. Doesn't that mean all of our tests will contain duplicate and redundant code? So then our next question was, how do we remove that dependency? That's when JUnit rule chains came to our rescue. So this is the boilerplate code for creating a rule chain. As you can see, we go through the login flow within this rule chain. Literally, the name of the rule chain wrapped around within a bunch of other rules in the setup of each test. We also ended up creating rule chains for requesting a ride. That way, all tests that need to request a ride can prevent writing duplicate code. So within my JUnit rule, you can see that I have incorporated some functional programming. This is nothing but reactive Java, or also popularly known as RX Java, which is critical when used to handle repetitive synchronous operations more efficiently, since all the ride requests along with the driver acceptance is happening within this rule chain. The test is completely abstracted from this complex logic. It only verifies if the relevant UI screen shows up. Now, after incorporating rule chains effectively into our framework, we've eliminated duplicate code and the test is easy to write for someone with limited programming background. As a quality engineer trying to scale my test framework, I learned that test execution time is not necessarily a performance issue. In fact, this only reiterates the fact that test design is equally important, which brings us to our second lesson on handling preconditions efficiently. A test is deemed flaky if it fails one out of, say, five runs. But understanding the root cause of flakiness, which in most cases is a setup conditions, will help to make tests more stable. And in this case, we incorporated rule chains to abstract the complex logic and make tests look much more cleaner. So now that we have discussed about implementing good test design, our next focus is to ensure we are scaling effectively. In lieu with the theme of this talk, this is how our fairy tale Cinderella reached the ball on time. It's important that our modern day Cinderella is aware of scaling best practices so she can plan and foresee her design decisions. So our tests were taking longer. Our bills were already 20 minutes, then another 20 minutes for the test to run. So we decided to investigate as to why these tests were taking longer. We were doing a lot of things within each test, plus validating locales and being run on different device types. Basically, apart from running it on tablets and phones, we were also validating different locales since the application was being used in different countries. So we wanted to make sure the experience was similar. So the solution to this problem seemed to be simple. Parallelized test runs, as it helps with reduction in execution time and cost of utilizing a third party device lab and hence more efficient. We chose to run our tests on file based device labs as it worked well with our parallelization test runner. Also, we ran into weird issues while running our tests on simulators. So it didn't make sense to spend time fixing them as our end users are never going to use simulators to request a ride. So we switched to using real devices as the errors were much more, relevant to us. So let's talk about how to quantify our modern day Cinderella's value add to the organization. Now, this is the equivalent of our fairy tale Cinderella meeting her Prince Charming. All the efforts put forward to strategize and develop a test framework will go in vain if there is no ROI tied to it. So, again, this is linked to our problem statement, which we discussed in the beginning. What problem are we trying to solve? If it is to reduce regression testing, then the ROI is the amount saved from having an offshore team doing testing, along with the money spent in hiring them. If the goal is to get frequent feedback, then it depends on the number of tests run against master. Or do we want to see how many bugs we found in this release? If automation takes care of regression, then quality engineers can focus their time on exploratory testing, which can lead to preventing those edge case bugs and crashes before we release. So finally, here's to handing out, hold on, yeah. Finally, here's to handing out our happily ever after ending to our modern day Cinderella. Here's a quick recap. In an effort to guide Cinderella with her quality engineer role, we started our discussion with defining the automation strategy, moved on to three specific challenges: the locator controversy, custom matcher rivalry, and scaling challenges. We also took a peek at two case studies and tied down all our efforts to ROI. And now our is well equipped to succeed. see a new role. As promised, you can find the Sandbox application located in my GitHub link. Um, Finally, I want to take a moment to thank the organizers at Nordic Testing Days for giving me this wonderful opportunity to present my talk virtually. Now we'll take questions.
Okay, thank you. Perfect timing. uh, yeah, I really liked your story, like how you this did the Cinderella in the end find his prince with his glass shoe and everything.
Yes, she does.
Okay, let's get down to the questions then. So, what is the best identifier type to insert into a product's code so that the element could be located on Android as well as iOS?
So that depends because a lot these days a lot of companies use React Native for developing their applications. So in that case, just adding one identifier is going to add it on both iOS and Android. But there are other companies which use native programming languages like Objective C on iOS, and then for Android it is Java and Kotlin. So going back, irrespective of which platform they're developing in, adding an identifier is much more useful, mainly because it doesn't end up with other conflicts. Say, for example, if you end up adding a text, then you don't know if there are texts with the same different texts in the same page, which could potentially be your test. And so, I would suggest adding an identifier as a locator.
Okay, about the strategy. Usually, strategy starts with the question why? Why to automate at all? And what did you automate and what you didn't automate?
Sure. As I mentioned, our goal was to, eventually validate analytics. So we were not looking at. I think I gave the example of video. So uh, during the course of a test, there were bugs around, the quality of the video versus the volume of the video. Sometimes when you're just scrolling through the feed, you don't hear the video sound, and only when you tap onto the pin and you open it up, that's when you hear the volume. Again, it goes back to if your device has the sound turned on or off. So those were things we were never able to validate via automated tests. Of course, that was responsibility of the quality engineer. Those use cases which we didn't automate, they were helping out. So, like I said, automation cannot completely replace manual testing. So it's just going to help scale it better. And there were use cases. What else? I think specifically coming to video quality, and then GIFs again. Whether the GIF was actually playing correctly, I think those were things which was very hard to automate. We had to rely on manual testing for those, and we focused
Okay.
mainly on the P zeros, which again was validating analytics.
What services do you use to test on multiple devices in parallel? Are there these chargeable services like Source Labs, Browser Stack, or did you have your own device farm?
Oh, yeah. So we analyzed different device farms, and we ended up using Firebase. Um, it worked out great for us. Again, we went through the paid plan, pay as per use, and what else? It's just that it worked out economically, in terms of the number of tests we were running. Because when we started out, we were only running once or twice per day. But then as we scaled our test automation efforts, we were running tests against PRs. Again, not the entire 100 tests. It's more like the P0 test cases were run against every single PR. And when I say P0, it's probably like 10 tests that are like a smoke test suite that is run against every PR, making sure whatever changes developers were making, they were getting faster feedback around their changes, and they were able to, uh, go ahead and deploy their changes quickly without having to wait for someone to manually test it. So.
Okay. How are the automated tests run and how they are tied to your general build deployment process?
Sure. So we had different levels of checks. So, like I said, when a developer is developing some code, let's say they're adding a new feature and they want to run a bunch of tests to make sure the basic functionality works fine. So, every single PR, so we use GitHub, that's our repository throughout the company. So, every time a developer creates a PR, the build runs, and then there is this smoke test that would run against the PR and say, "Hey, everything looks good. You're ready to, deploy the changes." And once they merge their code, then right before they deploy to staging, then we have our entire regression test suite that runs against the specific change. And if one test fails, it's going to trigger a call. Like, let's say we have a SLA defined where we need this person to fix the test within a couple of hours. And if they don't fix, then it'll trigger a pager duty call to the person who's on call. And if they don't respond within one day, then their manager gets paged. So basically, if the tests fail right before deployment, nobody can. I think what I'm trying to say is people can't just skip and say, "Hey, I don't care, something failed. I can go ahead and merge it," because that was a practice that was happening in the past, and we were trying to eliminate it by saying we want it all in the CI pipeline so that everyone has an idea. Like tomorrow, if there is a bug and if we want to go back and do a postmortem on why this bug was missed, we want to know if tests were even run against it. And I think having automated tests integrated in the CI/CD pipeline will help us identify. And if someone had skipped, um, people would basically go back and say, "Yeah, I didn't have time, so I just went ahead and merged." So now, with all these processes in place, nobody can do that. So that goes back to a lot of burden on us when we write tests, making sure that our tests are as stable as possible. So that is why we had to focus on test data setup and make sure our tests were not flaky at any point. And we also incorporated mocking in place. Again, especially when it comes to testing rides, it is hard for us to have a driver and a passenger in staging because everybody is testing on staging, which is a common shared environment. So we had to mock a lot of those dependencies, and that helped us also make sure that our tests were more stable.
Okay, thanks. What does Cinderella use to store local environments in Java test automation world? For instance, env file for JavaScript.
Uh, could you repeat the question? Sorry.
What does Cinderella use to store local environments in Java test automation world? For instance, environment file for JavaScript.
I see. So for Java, we have local.properties file. So that holds the environment specific information.
Okay. Why did you use Espresso, not Appium?
Yeah, there were a lot of other reasons to it. One thing mainly being, our iOS and Android apps did not have a common code base. So writing one single test and ensuring it'll be same on both was not true. And the other thing was, I think iOS was ahead in terms of features because the first Lyft application they developed was on iOS, and Android was just playing catch up. And so the features were not entirely the same. Like there used to be those tiny differences. So which means our tests wouldn't really work fine. Like as in, if we were to verify something on iOS, we can't do it unless we write a second test for Android. So it made sense for us to not go with a common solution for iOS and Android. And the last thing was, I think, back to how our tests are designed, like in general, Espresso built capability called the idling resource. And we were able to make sure, let's say a page is loading, and you don't want your test to fail, the page took a little longer to roll. So Espresso will feature where it waits for the page to load. So it understands, it's intelligent enough to understand that the page is loading. And again, this was going back to like 3 years ago when we decided which framework to use. Appium was not that ahead. I think now they've made a lot of changes. So I would have to go back and reevaluate and see if the older issues still persist or not. But at that time, I think we felt using native frameworks like Espresso for Android and XeUI test on iOS were the best ways to move forward, because we wanted to have a stable test suite.
Okay. What reporting tool is used for the evaluation results?
Sure. So we didn't do anything fancy because our focus was more on making sure our test framework was stable. And all of us at our company, we use Slack, and we decided we would use separate annotations for each feature team because quality engineers are embedded in each of the feature teams. So based on the annotations, we would define, once a test run completes, we would say, report the test results onto the specific feature team's Slack channel. So, and the report would be mainly total number of tests run, how many of them passed, how many of them failed, and then a link to your test run on Jenkins or Buildkite, whichever CI system you were using. And then that would take you to the list of test run links on Firebase. So that's how it would roll.
Okay. Did Cinderella face a situation to test the element inside an iframe? How is she doing that? So did Cinderella test anything inside an iframe?
I think this is iframe specific to iOS or Android. I'm not quite sure. I'm sure I've done that. I don't remember any specific example, but yeah.
Okay. I guess it's the last questions. We have 1 minute left. In terms of locator, how is Cinderella going to choose between XPath and CSS selector?
I see. So on the web side of things, I think I would go with expat, again, mainly because of stability issues. CSS has always known to be a little broken when it comes to leveraging it in tests. So my choice would be expat.
Okay, I would ask more questions, but time is pressing. So thank you very much for your interesting talk. As we can see from the number of questions, please provide. Please also rate the track so we could forward all the results to our presenters. And of course, visit our partners areas. And see you soon in our next track. Thank you.
Thank you.